Hello and welcome to Artful Inquiry, the Edinburgh College of Arts podcast, where our leading academics discuss their cutting-edge research in the fields of music, art history, design and architecture. I'm Dr. James Cook, Director of Research, and this week I'm in conversation with Dr. Una MacGlone and Professor Raymond MacDonald. We're going to be talking about diversifying improvisation. So, what is diversifying improvisation about?
There's two sort of real different elements that come together in the project. One is we wanted to commission new work. We wanted to give artists the chance to develop work that they wanted to write and let the work speak for itself, let the issues emerge from the work. But we wanted to combine this new artistic work with what we might want to call more conventional social psychological research processes as well, so focus groups and interviews. And then we wanted to marry this artistic work with the emergent themes from the interviews and then see what results and what implications we could develop.
We were awarded a research network grant by the Royal Society of Edinburgh to take this diversifying improvisation as a starting point and to work with 5 early career researchers who are all fantastic improvisers, academics and activists as well. So we were really interested in finding out about barriers to participation and what that might have meant for all of the people involved in our work. So we had a research question, a really straightforward one about what barriers to participation exist for creative musicians from diverse backgrounds. So that was the first thing we were thinking about. But also as creative practice researchers, we were interested in how people make work and collaborate. So a second research question was, what artistic strategies and logistical aspects for improvisation best serve the principles of a diversified, fully accessible space for creative practice? So with these two questions as a starting point, we then undertook a series of activities, including focus groups, interviews, rehearsals, and we have outputs such as performances, we have a panel discussion and short filmed interviews with people, as well as journal articles and an article for The Wire as well. So we have quite a rich array of outputs.
So I was wondering if you could talk us through a little bit of the motivation for embarking on this research project.
Sure. So Raymond and I are both musicians. Over the years, we've been consistently seeing and instigating initiatives of our own to counter these unbalanced gender ratios in professional music contexts. But we've been able to appreciate over the years that not all of these initiatives stick. Change will happen, but it doesn't stay consistently. Things can revert back to how they were before. And also thinking about improvisation, we sometimes think of ourselves as doing something that's quite special and quite niche, but improvisation is really coming into many musicians' practices. And as improvisation itself comes into the mainstream, we need to think about, well, are we questioning what organisational systems there are in improvisation, in commissioning, and who gets to participate in creative musical activities?
Yeah, and I guess we were particularly interested in commissioning new work as well, actually having new artistic work being developed, being recorded, being performed. And that, if in some ways, led this research project where we thought we'll commission 5 new pieces of work and we'll let the work speak for itself. And then the work will also inform the more what you might want to call conventional aspects of research, where we had interviews and focus groups, and we could combine the artistic work with the data that we get from the focus groups and interviews.
Before we hear a little bit more then about those works that you are commissioning, I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you see yourself as practice-based researchers. I mean, do you see yourself as practice-based researchers in your own work as well?
Yeah, well, very much so. Very much so. I mean, I guess I'm a saxophone player, a composer, and I'm constantly playing and collaborating with other musicians, other artists. While at the same time, I have a background as a psychologist as well, so I have an experimental background in psychology. So these two aspects of my work are kind of equal in many respects. So I definitely see myself as a practice-based researcher when you're writing and you're performing, and that conceptual development becomes part of your research aim to understand more about creative activities, give people access to creative activities that may have been denied access to creative activities, and also understand more about the basic elements of improvisation as well. So I guess the short answer is yes, I very much see myself as a practice-based researcher.
Yeah, and in a similar way, I'm a double bass player, and my first stage of my career was pretty much solely performing in all kinds of genres and creative contexts. But then at some point I decided I wanted just to look at things in a more systematic way. I've always been a teacher as well. I'm always really interested in education. So that informed my PhD and my postdoc. But latterly, especially through my postdoc, I'm interested in access to music as a whole, but access to creative music in particular. That's what I've chosen to specialise in my performing career. So yeah, and in a similar way to Raymond, one thing informs another. And I think the theory informs the playing and the interactions, the things you're interested in looking at, and in the ways that you feel that research can start to address some of the problems you might see out in the world, as it were. And I think that the two things for me are very closely entwined. And I think that's been very useful in this project, where I've had to be a good improviser, I've had to be a good musician, as well as a good researcher. I think these two things have been very important.
So that there are aspects here that you could only really approach and interrogate through practice itself.
Through practice itself and knowing about practice. In the project, we worked with 5 fantastic early career researchers who were all activists and all amazing musicians in their own right. We commissioned them to create new work. And as part of this commissioning process, we wanted to talk about the creative processes with each person. So to do that, that's where the kind of skills as an improviser and musician came in, as well as research. Because talking through creativity means I can imagine things musically, as well as like whatever theoretical framework we're drawing on as well. So they're very strongly enmeshed.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about these artists then, and the commissions, and the very different ways in which they seem to have approached things.
First, I'll talk about Diljit Kaurbacu. Diljit is a graduate of University of Edinburgh, and her work was about bringing community music practices into music education. She's an activist, and during COVID, she was part of a conference with Dr. Morag Grant here about decolonising the musical university. So she's been an activist for many years. She's currently EDI officer at the Musicians Union, but she does activist work all over. She works with conservatoires, music companies, universities to look at their EDI policies and help institutions develop these. Diljit's also a fantastic flute player with not a huge amount of experience in improvisation, but very creative and wanted to develop her work in this way. So she seemed like a really ideal person to work with because of that desire to kind of develop herself musically, and just also from her sort of amazing knowledge and experience that she gathered in her career since leaving Edinburgh. So Diljit talked a lot about her experiences in classical music education and being a flute player, specifically in orchestras, and how that sometimes seemed quite competitive with a culture of virtuosity. I mean, there's no doubt that playing principal flute or second flute in an orchestra is a very high pressure, difficult job, but the kind of relationships and social context that this can foster, and the way that education can reinforce this kind of competitiveness, was something that she wanted to distance herself from. She wanted to explore a more flattened hierarchy, more creative ways of working with people. So she wanted to work with other flautists collaboratively to develop a piece of work. We met for coffee, we chatted, and we worked together in a studio with other flute players. And in the end, she created a piece that also drew from one of her earliest experience improvising, and that was with Maggie Nichols. Maggie Nichols has been very active in the free improvisation scene for years and is a very experienced workshop leader. One of the pieces that Maggie does often is a piece called Sustain, and that is based on a piece by John Stevens. But Diljit had been to this workshop with Maggie, and this piece had really captured her imagination as a point from which to develop her own creativity with others in a group that provided a different and alternative space for flute playing that wasn't so caught up in this competitive virtuosity. But I wonder, Raymond, maybe you could, I mentioned Maggie.
Oh, wow, yeah. So I guess that Maggie Nichols is perhaps one of the most influential feminist improvising voices in contemporary music. I mean, she's been working since the mid-60s and developing a whole language of improvisation and activism. So through Maggie's improvising, through her performing, she's also challenging notions of composition and improvisation, was a founding member of the feminist improvising group in the late 70s. And she's really been a kind of feminist icon and a role model for generations of musicians who are not only wanting to improvise, but are also getting involved in gender politics and activism. And indeed, Maggie's just received an honorary degree from Edinburgh University in recognition of this lifetime of contributions that she's been making to not just improvised music, but contemporary music, and her position as she was born in Scotland, born in Edinburgh, but she's gone on to have a global impact. So, and Maggie's name comes up. I think that's another reason to mention Maggie at this point, because her name comes up time and time again when we speak to people about who are your influences and how did you develop your improvisational voice, and particularly thinking of the feminist agendas as well. So yeah, Maggie's a sort of world figure and also universally loved as well. I think that's safe to say.
Thank you. Would this be a nice time for us to have a listen to that piece? Great, thank you. I think that was interesting, given what you were talking about in terms of trying to explore hierarchies and break that down. I think you do really get a sense of that in the piece. It feels very open and, with a dialogue between the parts rather than any kind of one leading there.
We had all of the flutes there. We had a bass flute. We had shakuhachi, played by Dr. Nick Fells from the University of Glasgow. We had concert flutes, played by Dr. Graham Wilson, also from the University of Edinburgh at some point. I think Diljit had an alto flute, and then we had a piccolo as well. So we had this big range. The piece developed from very much playing with the breath, with the room, with each other, in the way that you could be influenced by other people's changes, but first starting from that place of the breath and sustaining long notes. And then gradually your awareness opens up and the interactions increase. But it's a really beautiful piece. I think maybe it's a good point to say as well that all of the performances are available on a YouTube channel for Diversifying Improvisation as well, so you can watch the whole thing there. I think it's 17 or 18 minutes, and it is very immersive. It's actually very beautifully grounding and relaxing. I don't think that was an intention, but because of the nature of the playing with the breath as well.
There's a real sense of community when I was listening to that piece there. There's the fragility of the individual voices, but that fragility is immersed in this much wider sense of community.
Yeah, I almost lost the sense actually of how many instruments we were listening to at points. I think you would have expected, given the vast sort of timbral differences and range.
Yeah, no, I find that I love when those moments emerge in improvisations as well, where you're not quite sure where the sound's coming from or who's making the sound, and you're just, both as an audience member, but as a musician myself, those moments of uncertainty and ambiguity can be really liberating. Maybe
you could tell us a bit more about another one of the projects then.
Yeah, so George Kypridimos is currently a PhD student, very near the end, at ECA. Their PhD is about activism, queer identity and improvisation as a site for political and social change. And George was really interesting because they, rather than create a piece for themselves, they felt it very, very important to distribute the commission and to work with other people. So George contacted Rian Afisi, who runs, it's a self-run gallery in the East End of Glasgow, and it's a queer-friendly space. It's putting on sound art. So that was one collaborator. And then George works a lot with the Glasgow Autonomous Community Orchestra, which is a queer-led improvising orchestra in Glasgow. They put out an open call for a weekend of music making and hospitality in Ria's Listen Gallery. I thought that was really interesting way of going about it. So rather than sitting and thinking about how can I make a piece for myself, it's like, how can I include as many people as possible in this opportunity, which speaks to George's work and their activism very strongly. So that piece is really beautiful. And Raymond and I were discussing, because we both are members of Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra, that there's the whole other worlds of improvisation that are springing up that we're not necessarily knowing about or being involved in, which sounds perhaps a little arrogant, but we were founder members of an improvising orchestra, and that was pretty much the only place you could improvise in Glasgow 20 years ago. But as I said earlier, improvising is firmly in the mainstream. It's firmly part of the skill set of musicians, and different pockets of activity are everywhere. So this was a really interesting way, I think, of George using the commission, and the music it produced is really beautiful as well.
So yeah, I suppose that's another one that's quite community-led, I suppose, even more sort of radically so than the first one. But I suppose without the kind of curation of timbres and instruments, I mean, how many musicians are we hearing there?
So they had 20 one day and 20 the next. I think there were different groups of people as well. I had COVID, so I couldn't make it along. But that actually shows the great strength of the project and the sort of the relationship you have as a researcher, as a practice-based researcher, I think, but also with George, there wasn't a problem. It's not like I had to be there to oversee the process. They were completely on top of everything and curated this wonderful space I got to see about in films and the performances afterwards. So, like I say, I think that's a strength, because we got to speak about everything afterwards as well.
I think it's a really interesting example of that relationship between the social dynamic and the musical dynamic, because George very carefully set up really inclusive social context, and using improvisation, the music almost took care of itself. You know, George invited people into the space, and if you see the film, it's a beautiful film, and you really get a sense of the dedication and the care that George took in creating this moment. And inviting people in, but the music emerges from the social dynamic that George has created, and improvisation's the process that allows the music to emerge.
Yes, sort of the composition is taking place in the framing of the event, and the creation of the group, and the dynamic there.
Yeah, very much so. So there was a very kind of specific access rider that people had to complete. So, I mean, and all, logistical terms of access, but also, if you're neurodiverse, about sound, about whether you need to take a break. So it was very detailed and a lot of care went into that. It's not just a kind of tick box exercise. So every participant was able to do an access rider. Also an important part, and Ria from Listen Gallery talks about it in the film as well, was the importance of making food and sharing food with everybody as an act of hospitality and care. And just as you said, it's framing the event in a way that is careful and shows respect and sets up the best place. So then you can be in a place of comfort and then able to improvise.
It also, I suppose, kind of shines a light on the degree to which all music making that we did have that framing at some point. We just aren't necessarily conscious of it, or conscious of the fact that often that does create boundaries instead of making it accessible. So that shines an interesting light, I suppose, on all our music making.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that George went to a community venue with a person he trusted to make that there. I'm not saying this wouldn't be possible within a university or a larger institution or even the CCA where we did other performances. Perhaps that's one of the lessons is to think about how you could take that process and could you bring it into the spaces that we're in now.
I suppose that link between sort of space and place and the social environment within which we make music, or really any kind of art, is a really important one.
I think it also speaks to that part of the project where we gave the artists freedom to do what they want. We just said, we're not asking you for a piece that has this particular element or is to be played at this time or in this place. We just said, please do something, and it's up to you what you want to do.
Of course, we had resources. We had resources to work. Obviously, we're very grateful to the IRC for the grant because I think it produced so many interesting outcomes. But just thinking in terms of resources and the resources we have as practice-based researchers and the trust that you have to have, I think if you're doing this kind of participatory work is really important as well. So the locations that the pieces happened in were different, and they were really tailored to what people wanted to do. But like I said, us being there at George's event wasn't necessary for it to be successful. We were just pleased to see how it turned out.
Would you like to tell us a bit more about the another one of the projects then?
Another one of our artists, Mariam Rezai, is working on a global level. I mean, Mariam is possibly one of the world's leading experimental turntablists, composers, who's working across a whole range of different contexts. Her recent work with the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra at Tectonics demonstrated how a turntablist, DJ, improviser can collaborate in real time with a symphony orchestra. And when we asked her to take part in the project, she was keen to collaborate with the Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra. And in a similar way, she's challenging conventional notions of what it means to be a composer, what it means to be a performer, and what it means to be an improviser. So she had a particular piece that involved her improvising with her turntables, but she invited members of the orchestra into that world, but didn't tell them what to play. She asked them to respond, to react, and to play with her. But she created this incredible, unique, vivacious and exhilarating sound world, quite different from anything else that we had commissioned, but also using improvisation as the primary process.
Yeah, I think that's really important to say, because I've seen Mariam talk about her process and people not realising the creativity that's involved in turntablism. She's not just playing a record. The processes involved they're purposeful, but she's also improvising, and the emergent processes that are coming out are essentially very creative. So in common with improvising with the BBC SSO and Glasgow Improvisers Orchestra, there's a heavy element of improvisation in both. But shall we hear what she did?
I was wondering if I could just pick up on something that you said in response to that. So you're mentioning that this is a piece that she has written and is sort of inviting the participation in an improvisatory manner, but there is still a maybe slightly more traditionally composed aspect to it. And I suppose it made me think a little bit about the idea of improv versus written approaches, and whether improvisation gives you more opportunities for a kind of radically different framing of traditional approaches to musical hierarchies. You know, the composer tells the players how to play, they play, the listeners listen.
I think we hear that in all the pieces that we're listening to today, this idea that, that we have commissioned new work, we've commissioned composers to write new work for us, and of course that Mariam has written that piece, but it's also got important elements of improvisation that's part of it. I guess one of our points is that perhaps the creative processes underlying improvisation and composition aren't as different as we might think as well. So Mariam's making really nuanced decisions about what to play and when to play it, and how loud to play something, and when to layer a one particular sample on top of another. And these are, we would argue, are composerly decisions, but they're happening in real time. And I guess improvisation allows us to explore the priorities of the moment, and allows us to bring in other people and invite other people into this decision making process, and in some respects distribute the compositional creativity around other people in the room. I think often we think of creativity as residing within an individual, and when we compose and when we perform, we display that creativity to the world. I guess myself and Una have talked a lot about the extent to which creativity is a much more of a social construct, so that when you're in a room, the creativity is distributed around all the people that are playing in that room in that particular moment. And I think Mariam's piece is a really good example of that.
Okay, so I think we've had a really good sense of how creative practice has been important for the exploration of the kind of research questions you have there. I suppose your work has used more traditional research approaches, such as sort of focus groups and things. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that intersects with the more creative practice and creative process work that you did.
Sure. So we kicked off the whole project with an online focus group, and we have an advisory group as well. So the advisory group comprised Professor George Lewis from Columbia University in New York. We also had Dr. Corey Mwamba, who until recently was presenting Freeness on Radio 3, which is a programme of improvising experimental music. We also had Atsi Muramatsu, who was part of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra's creative learning programme, but now he has moved to an amazing group called Sonic Bothy, who are an inclusive music group in Glasgow. And we also had Renee Baker, who is an amazingly prolific and creative composer from the States, and a member of the AACM.
The AACM is the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, based out of Chicago, and possibly the most influential large ensemble for working with creative black musicians. They've been going for nearly 60 years now, I think. So we were delighted to get Renee. And Renee's an old friend of us as well. We've worked with Renee many times over the years. We were delighted to have Renee and George Lewis as part of our advisory group.
Before the creative work started happening, there was a sense of us wanting to get to know each other, but also for Raymond and I just to get a better understanding of where people were coming from. All of the people in the advisory group and the five people we're working with have what you might call protected characteristics. So this means that protected characteristics can be race, disability, gender, sexuality, and so on. People can have more than one protected characteristics. But this is a kind of like legal term that recognises that people don't have equal access to opportunities. It was important to us to get a bit of a better understanding of that, but in a very kind of humble and receptive way, just so we could move forward with the research with just a bit of a better understanding. And of course, just acknowledging different types of privilege. You know, I consider myself to be very privileged. I'm at a fantastic university, but I'm also a woman. I'm a mother, and I've gone through various experiences in music myself. So I think that doesn't necessarily make me an expert in anyone else's experience, of course. But it's just to say these kind of conversations are tricky because they are so nuanced. But we wanted to approach a kind of conversation with everybody that was very open and honest from the start, for us to really tailor our approaches and support or not support people as best we could.
Really, this focus group, it wasn't just a light-hearted chit-chat about people's processes. It became a very serious and intense discussion about tangible barriers that people faced in the development of their career. And we discussed the nature of language and the nature of discourse that surrounds commissioning of new work, that surrounds performing and composing. And people gave very heartfelt and at times quite upsetting stories about the sort of barriers that they face. So we felt very privileged to be able to access these types of experience and also to combine this type of conventional research data with the artistic work. But we transcribed the focus groups and we coded the focus groups and we developed a set of themes around what the participants talk about, and they discussed the sort of language that people use when commissioning, talked about the sort of spaces that people play in and the way in which these spaces construct particular identities and particular expectations. We talked about the commissioning policies of festivals, of venues, of clubs, and how these commissioning policies on the one hand might appear to be meritocratic, but in some respects they consciously and unconsciously exclude certain members of society. And how can we challenge these conventions? So the issues that come up at the focus group were really, really important issues that we've also tried to fold into the research implications.
I will start with talking about the creative outputs. I think through thinking about the work, because there's a real danger in this type of work of further marginalising people if we're just talking about barriers in a way it's not particularly empowering. And people have done work about barriers and so on, and in maybe not specifically in music, though there's a field of research that's growing quite rapidly. There's a report out called Misogyny in Music, a government report from the start of the year, for example. But I think that the research in music's catching up with that. That's the point. But there has been various work in looking to barriers for people. But if that's what you're leading with, if that's how you're framing it, it might serve to marginalise people further. So we were really keen to talk about the creative processes as a way to explore experiences, to challenge hierarchies and so on. So I think that the approach and the findings that led to through the music we've heard so far, but also the interviews and discussions we've had about people's creative processes and how they've worked through considering barriers to inform their artistic processes and create pieces. Because, for example, if we're talking about spaces, people have pointed out, for example, Diljit pointed out the problems of the nighttime economy. As a single woman, you might not want to be playing in a club in the wrong end of town and, getting home safely and so on, and thinking about how these spaces can be quite gendered. And that informed where and when she wanted to perform her piece. So working through the findings of the focus group, but in a creative way, I think has been a strong finding from this. We also had a panel discussion in December after most of the work had been created, and we came up with 6 recommendations. But these recommendations were created as part of a panel discussion, so much like a lot of the processes involved in this work, they were essentially distributed, they were essentially creative. It was all about people coming together, and one person might have said an idea. So the first point in our 6 recommendations was to build nurturing relationships with people you want to commission. But that came from a group discussion. So all of these points that we worked on and then created our 6 recommendations from were in essentially a kind of collaborative, creative way. So that was an important finding as well. And the way we came about it was, as with everything else, in that kind of participatory way. So I'll just list them now. So the first one, as I said, was to build nurturing relationships. The second, to distribute agency and ownership. The third is to expect and build for difference. The fourth is to find new ways to think about improvisation and creative practice. The fifth is to be proactive about giving opportunities. And the sixth, micro-activism is important. It's the small, consistent actions that create sustainable change. Because that was an original point. That we're just going back to what we're talking about at the start, like seeing all these initiatives happen and time again and nothing sticking. And that point, that was from Diljit, actually, because that was a question that came from an audience member. It was like, how can we change things? And that was her answer. And I think that's an important point.
I think when thinking about how we change and how we develop sort of new work, one of our other artists, Maria Sappho, who was involved in creating a new instrument. So her commission involved building a new instrument and taking that instrument to the UNESCO City of Sound in Edinburgh and having a workshop that introduced this instrument to a new audience. And so in a similar way to many of our other artists, she was inviting people into her practice to hear what she played, but also to join her in an improvisation as well. And so she's giving people the chance to explore their creativity through music and hopefully as well contributing to this sense of change and of development, and of that maybe broadening people's horizons in terms of what they can expect from music participation and what they can expect from creative participation as well.
The other important thing to say about Maria's work is that she was working creatively with AI to make the instrument. So she was asking the specific AI about ways in which she could build her instrument. And so the AI was helping her troubleshoot this. But the actual ideas were realised by her. She physically made an instrument with woodworking tools and spalted wood. The instrument was designed to communicate with mushrooms. But do you want to say a bit about Chimère?
Yeah, sure. So I've been lucky to work with the same artificial intelligence that Maria Sappho is working with as well. And so I guess when we work with an artificial intelligence, often, and a lot of the public discourse around artificial intelligence is about the power dynamic that exists. Will artificial intelligences be taking over the world, and what happens if there's a catastrophic mistake, and what are the implications? But for myself and for Maria as well, working with an artificial intelligence also helps us understand the nature of collaboration and different ways of working within a world that's not necessarily what we might call post-human identities, if you like. So how do we collaborate with machines? How do we collaborate and communicate with nature? And how do we collaborate with ourselves within broader communities? And you might argue that these are some of the biggest and most fundamental questions we face as a society. And when we work with an artificial intelligence, we can understand more about the nature of collaboration. And I think Maria's project really demonstrated quite beautifully. She has this exquisitely complex, beautiful new instrument that could only have emerged in this collaboration with Chimère, an artificial intelligence who's providing ideas, who's providing conversations, Maria's asking the artificial intelligence, how many strings do you think it should have? What sort of sound do you think it could make? The sorts of questions you might ask with your friend or your collaborator if you're working with them. So this sense of collaborating with an AI and being part of a community once again, so there's Maria, there's the AI, but then there's the audience coming in, and Una played with Maria in the performance as well. So in some respects, the composition is not only coming from the AI, it's not only coming from Maria, but it's coming from Una as well. And that compositional creativity is distributed in a non-human entity and through to the audience as well. And I think Maria's work is really at the sort of forefront of this global interest in what it means to collaborate with machines and how we engage with what we're going to call the post-human identity world that we're working in. So Maria brought this whole new sort of range of experiences and this whole new instrument to the project, and that was really exciting for us.
Could we have a listen to that as well?
Certainly.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you see as the most important real-world applications of your work so far.
I think in working to increase access, in working to diversify creative music context, there's a few things. I think, interestingly, one of the points that came up from the first focus group was George Lewis's dislike of the word diversification or diversifying. I think partly because it's often a kind of tick box exercise and there's not so much depth, but a point for commissioning in the future is that there has to be depth, there has to be time taken to be working in a way that is truly inclusive. There needs to be the time and care taken, so it's not a tick box exercise that things are truly diversified, then the time and opportunities are taken to do that. So thinking about places for performing music, that I think organisations should be a lot more bold and dynamic with thinking about where music can go. And that is a response to what people's aesthetic or needs or all these kind of different things. We need to think about different contexts. So, for example, Maria really wanted to present at University of Edinburgh. She wanted to speak to academics about her work. She wanted to talk about implications of AI and post-humanism. George wanted to work in an art gallery. So the project has given room for different places. And I think that's something that could definitely be taken forward by anyone thinking about commissioning and even indeed performing. So why do we have to go to the same places all the time? Who do we want to reach? We can't necessarily just invite everyone to us. I think we need to really go out and meet people where they are. So I think that's one important point that's come out of it.
Yeah, I think also in terms of giving people the opportunity to explore their creativity, to explore their ideas, is a really important implication of this, of the work, that so often people want to be creative, they want to play music, they want to get involved in creative activities, but they feel they don't have the opportunity or they are denied the opportunity. And so what we're suggesting is that if we can think of new and imaginative ways to set up projects, to set up concerts, to set up festivals, that gives people the chance to explore their creativity, then fascinating, exciting and interesting work will emerge. And that work will not only sustain communities, but it will enhance communities as well, because there's a very close link between the creative work and the wider social and psychological aspects of that work.
My last question is, where next?
So we have one final commission, and that's with Dr. Sonia Alori. Sonia is a musician and music therapist. She works with a group called Sonic Bothy as an improviser, and the commission has been delayed, but we'll be doing it later on this year. And that's going to be involving creative captioning as a site for exploring identity and creativity. So we're very much looking forward to working with Sonia with that. We have everything ready and waiting to go. So that'll be the last piece. What next as well is that Raymond and I are also looking at further opportunities, funding opportunities and performance opportunities to extend the work and the research. We kind of believe that there's huge potential in the work that we've done so far, and we would like to take this further, whether that's through more funding or seeking opportunities for performing. And also thinking about it from a personal point of view as well, our own artistic practices. Speaking for myself, maybe you can say as well, but for me, I think the project's been really interesting in terms of personal development, to think about how I'm engaging and interacting with people, and like I say, the necessary care. I don't think I was in a bad place, but I think that working through the nature of barriers with people, but also the creative processes with people, has been incredibly enriching. And I think that personally it's been useful, but there are implications for other individuals, other musicians, but also people who are commissioning music and people who are putting music on.
I've just so excited by the work that we have, the recordings that we have, the films that we have, the conversations that we've had. And I really hope that we can take the work that we've already produced and disseminate it as widely as possible, whether that's through a website, whether we have our festival, whether we have public engagement activities, to just let this new work sing, if you like, and let people hear it and experience it. And from that new work, I'm absolutely convinced that more new work will develop as well. I felt, even just today's process of listening to the pieces and talk, I felt so immensely privileged to be part of the creative process of all these amazing individuals that have created work for us. It's been a real joy to experience it.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much for sharing it with all of us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you'd like to find out more about the research project discussed in today's episode, you can look at the show notes here on Spotify. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about research at ECA in general, please do look at our website at www.eca.ed.ac.uk/research. If you've enjoyed this episode of Artful Inquiry, please do hit the subscribe button now to be notified of new episodes in the future. And of course, do share the podcast with people who you think might enjoy it. All that remains is for me to thank our guests this week, Dr. Una MacGlone and Professor Raymond MacDonald, and of course you, our listeners. Next week, we'll be talking to Anna Talley about how disinformation is designed.